important weekend in the West.
Yeah, really exciting. We knew Illinois was going to be good when we left camp, I think. I don't know that we thought they were going to be this good, but other than last week and the opener against Indiana, they've looked pretty good.
We will see whether or not they bounce back this week and continue to be in the driver's seat in the race for Indianapolis. That is our big story. Well, we'll take a look first at the entire slate this week, and a little bit of a calm before the storm feel in the East, just given that neither Ohio State nor Michigan has a high-profile opponent this week, though we saw both get pushed a bit by seemingly inferior teams last week. The primary intrigue, though, is in the West. Purdue and Illinois in that early window, Wisconsin and Iowa in the later one. And then as we look at the West standings, we've mentioned this a few times this week, that literally every team in the division amazingly still has a path to Indy. The easiest one, though, does belong to the Illini. If they beat Purdue and beat Northwestern in their season finale, they are in. Were the Boilers to win Saturday, things would get far more complicated. So, feels like the first order of business is who's going to win. I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction, but I'm going to ask you to tell us X and O wise what you think might dictate who comes out on top.
You know, a stat, and you were the first one that brought this up to me, I don't know how many years ago, but a stat that no longer is that important as time of possession, although I do...
18 years ago.
18 years ago.
Yeah.
I do think that this week when Illinois plays Purdue, it has something to do with the game. Maybe not the most important stat, but that comes down to Illinois possessing the ball. That's how they want to play it. Now, if you look at Illinois coming off last week, when we've talked about this, the red zone was a problem. Going forward on fourth down 6 times and only making 1, that's not Illinois-type football, although they have struggled in the red zone most of the year. The interesting thing about the red zone struggles, and we talked about Michigan, the same thing. A team that runs the ball as well as Illinois does, they're the ones most equipped to run in the red zone because they can control a line of scrimmage and they're not really a passing team. So they have to get that fixed. Purdue, on the other hand, you look at Purdue, the same problems continue to come up, right? I mean, offensive line, pass protection, run game, and so dependent on Aiden O'Connell's performance, and they're a quarterback-based team. They're not a spread team necessarily, but they are a team that if the quarterback plays well, the offense plays well. If the offense plays well, they usually win the game. And so it's going to come down to 2 drastically different styles. The Illinois defense will control the line of scrimmage, especially if Purdue can't run the ball or at least make Illinois defend the run.
I think the thing that would really concern me from Purdue's point of view is that their strength, and it hasn't been a great strength recently, as you said, O'Connell has not played all that well here over these last couple games, but the thing that you fear with them offensively when you prepare for them plays right into Illinois' hands. I mean, their pass defense is so good. They get so much pressure on the quarterback, among the top 3 teams in the country in terms of the percentage of times that they pressure the quarterback. They lead the nation in interceptions. He's made a lot of mistakes recently. It just feels like everything favors the Fighting Illini in that part of the matchup.
Especially to accentuate your point, they can get a rush with 4 men. And when you can do that defensively, obviously you help your back end. And so Illinois does get a lot of pressure on their opponent, but they don't bring the 5th rusher. They certainly don't bring the 6th rusher all that much. And so that's a problem. It was a problem for Purdue a week ago that they were getting pressure with 4, and Aiden O'Connell wasn't always comfortable in the pocket.
You were talking about controlling the line of scrimmage for Illinois and Chase Brown. We've seen Purdue's defense, I would say, take a bit of a step back this year. It was really good last year. I think it was an underrated part of why they had such a good year. It feels like these last few games, they just have not been at the level that they were a year ago. Do you think they're good enough defensively to have a chance against what has become a pretty good Illinois offense in terms of, as you said, controlling the ball? They've got the nation's leader in terms of rushing yards per game. They have a really good, accurate quarterback in Tommy DeVito. How do you see that part of the matchup?
I say Purdue been able to match up. I go back to the Syracuse game and games since the Syracuse game. It's the back end that has really given Purdue probably some issues they didn't have last year. So when you compare Purdue's defense from this year to last year, I think it's really the back end that hasn't played as well. And I can't remember how many players they lost there. But, Illinois is not a passing team. It's a running team. I think that gives Ron English, defensive coordinator at Purdue, a little bit of chance to put his secondary in position to be successful. It's not a great passing attack that they're going against, and that's kind of where Purdue has had some troubles this year with their defense.
4 straight games allowing at least 24 points. What do you think about the mental aspect of that game? Just kind of the notion that Illinois, it was right there in front of them. I mean, all they needed to do was win last week, and then this game would have been the one for Indy. They stubbed their toe against Michigan State. Purdue, we have seen play poorly. I would say the last 2 times out really have not been the team that we would expect them to be. In terms of kind of how they come in mindset-wise, does anyone have the edge there? How concerned are you?
Well, I think they both have enough to be motivated. I think Illinois has the edge because I think they feel like, and again, players read the schedule, right? If they beat Purdue and they beat Northwestern, they're going to Indy. I mean, as a player and as a coach, I always felt like if it was in my hands, I was going to take responsibility and play the very best I could play. And I think I have to believe every Illinois coach and every Illinois player feels that way. Nobody can take this away from us if we beat Purdue and Northwestern. I mean, they would have gone undefeated in the West. They would be clearly the best team in the West. I mean, that's something to jump out of bed every morning. For Purdue, Purdue's been an up and down team. But the fact that we have 3 games left and Purdue still can go to Indy. Now, if Purdue wins, I don't know how long it's going to take any of us to figure out
how they chaos if Purdue wins.
It's total chaos.
Yes.
And I'd rather take the sure bet that Illinois has than the chaos Purdue has. But, we're in November, and Purdue still can go to Indy. And, so that should be a highly motivated team.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly, Iowa and Wisconsin are rooting for Purdue because part of the reason that it becomes chaos were Purdue to win is Iowa and Wisconsin have favorable head-to-heads, whereas they both lost to Illinois. Yes, you got a point here.
Well, the other cool thing is I don't think we've ever had a West Division team go undefeated. And this is a pet peeve of mine that an undefeated team should go to Indy regardless, right? That's not the case this year. But have we ever had a West team that lost 3 East Division games and won all? That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, again, to me, I think a lot of players are built that way. A lot of coaches are built that way. Undefeated in the division. Is that the first time it's happened? If it is, it's pretty cool.
To be undefeated in the division, then lose all 3 crossovers. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but you've always been the one who's advocated for no matter what happens, if you win all your games against the division, you should go. And I do think it's tough to argue that point, that you're the best team and the crossovers there's a randomness to those.
But even though it's not that way, I'm not fighting for the rule.
Yeah, no, I understand.
I think that's cool, and I think it's
absolutely,
it's a great
and that's
motivator.
right there for the taking.
I mean, if you get a ring for Western Division, somewhere in that ring, it's going to say undefeated in the West.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, no doubt. What about this Iowa-Wisconsin game? I would argue these are 2 teams that are probably feeling better about themselves right now than they have at any time this year. And now we get them going head-to-head. We know what a good rivalry this is. What stands out here as you match these 2 up?
Absolutely, both of them playing their best ball, without question. Both built defensively, but built so different defensively, right? You look at the Iowa defense, they're pretty much a zone coverage team or a matchup zone, if you will. I think Phil Parker likes to consider them man within a zone. They don't do much with their front. They're 2 technique and 3 technique. And then you have Wisconsin, 3-man front, really. The first time, when you play Wisconsin, it's the first time you face the 3-man front. And that means you have to get ready for it on Tuesday and Wednesday. That is hard to do. And so I think Wisconsin gets the edge, not because they're necessarily a better defense than Iowa, but for 2 days to prepare for it, Wisconsin's going to give Iowa's offensive line more fits than the other way around, right? Because Wisconsin's used to blocking the 1 technique, blocking the 3 technique, blocking the 7 technique, because they've done it all season, right? And so now it comes down to what offense can move the ball against a really good defense. And I think the edge goes to Wisconsin against a different style of defense than Iowa's going to face. Iowa's going to face all kinds of problems, personnel-wise and scheme-wise, that they haven't faced, and get ready in 2 days. It's hard to do.
And we know what an issue the offensive line has been here for Iowa the last couple of years.
Their best.
It's not been great, and I think so much of the blame always goes to the quarterback position. and to a lesser extent to your inability to run the ball when you're struggling offensively. But as we know, it all goes through the offensive line. And yet here we are, last 2 games, Spencer Petras has looked great. Right. And it feels like they found a run game here with Caleb Johnson. Does it change the dynamic of the way that Wisconsin plays them in particular, given that there is more of a threat in the run game than you might have thought there was, say, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, I think it helps them. No doubt the fact that they've been playing this as good a ball as they've played all year. Plus, they play Wisconsin every year, right? So during the offseason, they're studying the 3-man front and how to attack it. They've pulled out old game plans. So it's not like they're going to be totally surprised. But again, the offensive line's used to blocking a lot different front, and this is going to be a line of scrimmage game, right? We can't imagine that we're talking about Wisconsin and Iowa playing and don't think that the line of scrimmage is going to be a major factor, right? It wouldn't be Iowa and Wisconsin if we were talking about, it's not Ohio State, Maryland. I mean, that's the opposite. So obviously Brian Ferentz and the offensive coaches know what to do against the 3-man front. It's just harder to execute, especially when you have 2 days to block it.
And I like the stakes in this one. Look, I know these are fan bases where you literally put a bowl game into your schedule in ink at the beginning of the year. That is the minimum expectation. But still, to be in the middle of November and to be playing with the winner becoming bowl eligible, I think there's something to that it's a trophy game and that it means a lot to the fan bases. There's a little bit more to this game, I think, than meets the eye.
And it's in Iowa City.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's a big advantage.
Yeah, you're saying big advantage for Iowa.
I think so.
Yeah.
Even more so than if they were playing at Wisconsin. I think the advantage for Iowa in Iowa City is better than the advantage Wisconsin in Madison.
As we know, Badgers have had their way in this series, winners of 5 of the last 6. More we're used to hearing Joel Klatt every Saturday in the booth during Fox's Big Noon kickoff game. But if you want to hear more from Joel and his unfiltered thoughts and all the biggest stories in college football, make sure you subscribe to the Joel Klatt Show wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop 3 times per week. We are happy to welcome Joel 1 time per week here on Big Ten Today, and we have him right now. Joel, I want to start by reacting to the College Football Playoff Committee, as I suspect we'll be doing a lot here going forward on Thursdays the rest of this fall. I noticed that your top 7 essentially completely parallels theirs, other than you had Michigan and Ohio State flip-flopped, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I assume you are full of praise for the committee this week, given how closely you align with them.
Yeah, other than the fact that they're like an umpire that called the ball 2 inches off the corner of the plate, and then in the next inning you didn't get that call because nothing changed for like TCU. It's the exact same situation. So clearly, Rev, peer pressure works. Right? Now, listen, I knew this as a kid, right? It worked on me, unfortunately. And this peer pressure was in a positive direction. I think that the committee heard those of us that were arguing that, hey, listen, this doesn't make sense. TCU deserves to be a little bit higher than what they are. And they adjusted course on their second edition of the rankings. Because if you really look at it, nothing's different, right? You have a 1-loss SEC team that, by the way, Tennessee has a better resume than Alabama did a week ago. And you have the same exact excuse that they gave for TCU being at 7 last week, and like, oh, they're down in games and have to come back. Same thing happened against Tech last week, and then all of a sudden they're at 4. So a little bit of an inconsistency, but peer pressure works.
All of the parents here are cringing knowingly as you bring that up. Let's talk a little bit about TCU, because you saw them in person last week in that game against Texas Tech. They have a very challenging schedule coming up starting this week against Texas. They still have Baylor as well. How good are they? Like, do they have a chance to get through this unscathed?
I mean, a chance. I would say it's a small chance.
How good a chance is probably a better way to phrase it.
I don't think it's that high, to your point, and I think it's an astute one. They've got to go to Texas. They've got to go to Baylor. Those are, I think, 2 of the tougher matchups that you have in the Big 12 this year, and then particularly Texas. The question then remains, like, is Texas going to become one of those teams that's in the top tier in college football? Are they going to play to their talent level? And is their home stadium going to become an environment like those top tier programs have? So when I'm looking at TCU, I'm looking at the fact they've got to go to Texas this week. If you're going to Georgia or Alabama or to Oregon, to Clemson, to Ohio State, man, it's hard to win. Rev, you know that. And the numbers bear that out, right? I mean, Alabama's, I think, won 49 of their last 50 home games. Clemson has won 38 straight. Oregon, 23 straight. I think Ohio State's won, I think, like 33 of their last 34. I might even be shorting them on that a little bit. Like, these great teams have great home field advantages. The problem is Texas, while they have the talent, they want to be on that tier, but they haven't played to that extent. They're 11-5 at home in the last 3 years. They're 8-3 at home under Sark. So that has to change. Can TCU win this week? Yeah, I think that they can win. Is Texas getting better and heading towards the point where I think that they're going to be able to defend their home stadium? Yeah, I do. So I think TCU is going to be in an uphill battle, whether it's this week against Texas or even on the road against Baylor as well.
I do want to get into the Big Ten teams. I found it interesting that you had Michigan in your rankings ahead of Ohio State, particularly because you have seen those teams maybe more than anyone in the country in person, just in terms of being able to compare them, having seen them both in person a significant number of times. Why did you put Michigan ahead of Ohio State?
I'm a big believer in consistency, and I think that while Ohio State has the higher ceiling and overall potential, I think Michigan has proven to have the higher floor. And it might be style, and that's fine, and game plan specific, but I couldn't in good conscience look at that Ohio State team and the way that they played, in particular on the offensive line, against Northwestern, and say, like, yeah, like, benefit of the doubt. And I get it. Like, the weather was horrendous. By the way, I might get it better than anybody, because when I was playing, Rev, we actually got delayed against Iowa State when I was a senior at Colorado because of a legitimate tornado, right? Like, that happened at Iowa State. And we went out there in the first quarter, and we were playing into about 35, 40, 45, 50-mile-an-hour winds. I know how tough it is to throw the ball and to move the ball. And the point being is that you've got to rely on a dominant offensive line. And their personnel should be able to dominate Northwestern's personnel. Northwestern hasn't won a game since week 0. And listen, I'm all for the fighting Pat Fitzgeralds, right? Like, I get it. Northwestern is tough and they're scrappy. Ohio State should be able to hand the ball off 60 times and win comfortably. That's just my opinion. And I think Michigan is more in that mold. I know what I'm going to get from them, regardless of rain, shine, wind, no wind, game location. I know what I'm going to get from Michigan, and it's for that reason that I moved them ahead. Buckeye fans, I've said this on my podcast, all week, they are crashing the weather app on their phone looking for November 26th. They're just like, what is the weather when we face Michigan? And to me, like, isn't that a problem, right? Like, you're a Big Ten team. You should be able to play through the elements, and I don't know if they can.
I don't know whether the forecast goes that far ahead. We might need to get to the Farmer's
Exactly. That's why they're
right?
like this the whole time. They're like, when is it going to come up,
It is interesting that what you are citing is what I think many of us believe the committee was meant to do, which is you watch both teams and you say who you think's better. I think part of how the committee is justifying this is, well, Michigan didn't play anyone in the non-conference, and Ohio State challenged themselves with a game against Notre Dame, who, while yes, they have lost to Stanford and Marshall at home, they also are now a top 25 team and beat Clemson this week, and so their strength of schedule is better, and they have a better marquee win. It seems to me that's more what this is about from the committee's point of view. That's kind of how they justify it versus, well, we watched them both and we just think Ohio State's better.
And I'm fine with that, right? I mean, like, I get it, and they did lean on the resume, and they're correct when it comes to the resume. You go a step further, similar opponents, Ohio State has done a little bit better, other than Penn State, although the Penn State win, kind of sneaky, is one of the best wins in the country. Did you know, Rev, that there's only been 11 matchups between top 15 teams so far this year in college football? The road team is 1-10 in those matchups, only win being Ohio State at Penn State. So that's a huge feather in the cap of the Buckeyes. I would say, and I know you didn't ask me about it, but listen, I tend to just be long-winded. I just don't think the ACC has any legitimate argument to have a path to the playoff, even if Clemson was a one-loss conference champion. And the reason is because of Notre Dame. Rev, when you look at what Notre Dame has done this year, they have, in my eyes, ended the ACC's chances at getting a playoff opponent. Notre Dame against every other conference, any other team in America, they are 3-3 with losses to Ohio State, Stanford, and Marshall. Stanford and Marshall at home. Their only Power 5 win outside of the ACC. Cal. Then you face the ACC. Well, what'd they do? So they're very average, one-dimensional, 115th ranked passing offense, one-dimensional on offense. So what happened? They faced Clemson, North Carolina, and Syracuse, 3 teams that are in the top third in the ACC this year. They're 3-0 in those games, including handling Clemson, the juggernaut of the ACC, beating North Carolina at North Carolina, who's going to be the championship game participant in all likelihood, and Syracuse on the road at Syracuse. How in good conscience can the committee take the ACC champ, even if it is Clemson, and put them in the playoff when Notre Dame has dismantled the top end of the conference in a year in which they lost to Stanford and Marshall at home?
I don't think they can. I'm with you. I mean, I think that the ACC's done. It's crazy, of course, that Notre Dame has this arrangement with the ACC where they get to pick and choose, right? They get their 5 games a year, and they still get to play Stanford and USC and Navy, and they've basically disrupted the conference's hopes of making it into the playoff. I do want to ask you, before we leave the Big Ten, what are the chances in your mind? Like, what would have to happen, I guess, is a better way to phrase it, for the Big Ten to get 2 teams in? I don't want to be greedy, but Big Ten's got 2 and 3 right now in the rankings. So it's not unreasonable to think that this could be a conversation here going forward. How would it need to play out?
Well, I guess I jumped too far ahead, because that argument that I just gave about the ACC, in my mind, not having a really clear path is the reason why I think that there is a shot for 2 Big Ten teams. If you just play it out in your head, the Big 12, this schedule down the stretch is not easy for TCU. So I don't see a scenario where there's an undefeated Big 12 TCU champion, okay? The Pac-12, by the way, is similar to this. Oregon's going to have to face Utah. USC and UCLA play each other. Oregon also has to play Washington this week. They've got to go to Oregon State. Then they've got their championship game. So there's a good chance that you don't have a real clean playoff contender out of the Pac-12. So in that scenario, all of a sudden you would be sitting there, and if you just play it out in your head, let's say Georgia wins out, then you would have Tennessee kind of sitting there on the sideline at 11-1. You would have the Big Ten champion, whoever won that Michigan-Ohio State game, and then you'd basically have Clemson against that next Big Ten team. And the argument I just gave against the ACC and what Notre Dame did to that ACC, I think gives the Big Ten the argument in that, and I think you would get 2 SEC and 2 Big Ten teams in the playoff in a situation like that.
I like the way you're thinking. We'll see how it plays out. We always know chaos tends to ensue in college football down the stretch. We'll see you for Big Noon on Saturday with Gus and Jenny as you guys bring us Ohio State and Indiana. Safe travels out there, and thanks as always for your time, Joel. Ohio State and Michigan, the focal point for the Big Ten down the stretch, on a collision course for the Thanksgiving week showdown as 2 of college football's remaining 4 unbeatens. Really complete teams, both in the top 10 in scoring offense and scoring defense. Michigan has Nebraska this week. The Buckeyes battle Indiana. Jerry's back with me. You heard Joel say that he thinks right now Michigan's a better team than Ohio State. I don't think he thinks there's much separation. Obviously, as the 2 and 3, the committee has it flip-flopped. I'm not sure it matters all that much, because the beauty of it is we'll see it on the field. But how would you kind of stack them up relative to one another, and just kind of where your points of interest are here as we head towards that big showdown?
Well, not in the vein of the playoffs, but just watching both teams. As Joel and you had a conversation, I think Michigan's is the better team right now, playing better. I think there is little room for error or difference. Probably depends on the day. I think the weather is going to be a big factor. The fact that they're playing in Columbus will be a big factor when they do play. But right now, I'd say Michigan's playing better.
Okay, what stands out? Like, why do you, if you were to kind of stack them up against one another, and I don't know if it's check marks so much as who's playing better at each position, or more just kind of the area that sways the balance to Michigan, what would you say?
Okay, so we could do it position by position, but I think when you're talking about 2 teams, 2 of the best 4 teams in the country, you look for weaknesses, right? It's not you're negative, you just look where their weakness is. I think it's clear that Ohio State has a weakness in the run game, right? It looks like Ohio State has a weakness when the weather's bad, right? If you look
it's a small sample size.
But we're talking about number 2 and number 3.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
But here's the one. Here's the biggest difference of everything. We can go offensive line, defensive line, and I've been racking my brain all day how to verbalize this. Okay, and I figured out what I want to say. After the Notre Dame game, Ryan Day went to the press conference, and the one thing he said was, "We took over the game with the run game and toughness. And everyone challenged our toughness, and we were tough today." And he was proud. I mean, he was emotional. Wouldn't the Northwestern game have been another opportunity to say that? But he couldn't say it because it wasn't true against Northwestern. Doesn't mean the team's not tough. Doesn't mean the players aren't tough. But it does mean that toughness, when you're talking about 2 elite teams that are going to play one another, I got a feeling it's going to be a tough game, right? So does toughness separate them? I'm not saying Ohio State's not tough. I might be saying I think Michigan's tougher, but that's the only way I can put my finger on this toughness issue, which I think is a big part of these 2 teams.
Yeah.
It's easy to say the offensive line's not playing well. It's easy to say the offense isn't physical enough. Does that come under that umbrella? Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. They're certainly talented. Those 5 big guys, they're pretty talented for Ohio State.
No doubt. I mean, you see them in person as we do in camp, and it's borderline awe-inspiring. I think where this comes into play for me is because, well, first of all, I mean, it's just football, and the line of scrimmage, especially in the Big Ten, is where games are won and lost. But in particular, it's where that game was won and lost last year. One team was able to impose its will. Michigan imposed its will in the second half against Ohio State, and the Buckeyes simply did not have an answer for it. And so if that blueprint was laid out last year, this is the way that we're going to attack this game against Ohio State, and it was a successful blueprint, then you say to yourself, they're going to go back to that blueprint, right? Why, after all the lack of success they've had against them, this is who they become. And so it's up to Ohio State to answer it. Now, I would say the flip side of that is, if we watch Michigan, we were talking about this on our conference call today. Some of these one-on-one battles with their secondary, they have lost.
Correct.
To Rutgers, they lost them, and Rutgers has struggled to move the ball on anyone. And Gavin Wimsatt had a couple of one-on-one throws that he put up there that the Rutgers receivers came down with. Keon Coleman was a matchup problem for Michigan against Michigan State. Ohio State's got some pretty good wide receivers. So, I mean, I understand that, like, you can go back to last year, and I agree with you. I'm not in any way debating it, because that's how the game was won last year. But there are areas where Michigan is struggling, too, relatively speaking, where I think Ohio State is particularly well poised to take advantage of them.
Okay, so let me respond to both things, but you make 2 great points. Let's go back to last year's game. It's comparable, but not totally, because the defense has changed. So last year, Michigan took over the line of scrimmage against Ohio State in Ann Arbor, but Ohio State was voided some gaps. They weren't. Ryan Day. Ryan Day made a change in defensive coordinators, and so that wasn't. Let's say that Michigan won the line of scrimmage, but they also out-schemed them, which they did. They out-schemed, they inserted a blocker, and they added the gap, and Ohio State struggled to make the adjustment. If it comes down to throwing the ball deep and Ohio State can protect it, they'll probably win the game against Michigan. Toughness doesn't always come into the equation. It just depends on the flow of the game. But I think that could be one thing that separates it. It may not come down to that. If it comes down to the deep ball and the unbelievable receivers of Ohio State and the secondary of Michigan, if it comes down to that, Ohio State probably win the game. I just would hate to leave it to that part of the equation, right? Nobody wants to leave it. Nobody wants to leave it there. What happens if it comes to you have to run the ball in the red zone? I mean, so we can pick what situation we can put both of these second and third ranked team in the country. We can paint a scenario where it favors one or the other of this team.
Yeah.
These teams. right?
Right, and that's a beauty. So I think what you're
they're
saying.
matchup opponents, right? We usually talk about
yes, I mean they absolutely are, and so I think your point there is they could play 100 times, and maybe it's what we're looking for is who's the team that wins 58 versus 42, because I don't think anyone's going to be able to go in and say, well, Team X is, Ohio State's definitely going to win, Michigan's definitely going to win. They're too close. So where are the relative strengths, and then are you able to game plan in such a way that you can enhance your strengths and negate the areas where you don't match up, right? I mean, that's your job.
And I would be embarrassed for myself if I didn't bring up revenge. When was the last time? When was the last time Ohio State was seeking revenge?
Yeah.
I don't even know what it is.
I've known you for a long time, and I know revenge is very important to you.
I'm just saying, it's part of the game.
I pity Mike Hall, knowing how much you value revenge.
Oh, he's going to get his, yeah.
Some interesting games there, Jerry. Wrap things up here. I'm excited about Maryland and Penn State. To me, we know about the rivalry between these coaches, or the history maybe is a better way of putting it. But I think it's also an important game for both of them. Penn State to continue to kind of exert their place in the East, and Maryland to make a case for the fact that they're moving up.
Yeah, there's no doubt the coaches aren't sharing a beach house. I mean, we know that. They might get together once in a while. I think that the matchup that favors Penn State the most is the pressure on the offense and the offensive line of Maryland. I think that's where the game could be won or lost. And yet, if you put Penn State on offense, Maryland's defense has improved. I think Maryland is at a place where this is a huge game for them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably bigger in their locker room than it is in Penn State. And we know James Franklin, 1-0, Maryland. So I don't know that it's the same for Mike Locksley in Maryland, because Maryland's trying to build a program. They're in the East with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. They've made improvement. They're bowl eligible. So it's a huge game for Maryland, and I think James is more clinical. It's just the next opponent, and we're going to go out and do what we do.
I like how you tried to filibuster there. You almost to point out today. I'm into numbers.
Oh, jeez.
We won't say the number. We'll just say that it's a round one. Happy birthday, Coach. We got a little something. Haley and Jarrett, or just Haley. Jarrett doesn't want to go on TV again, I guess. So,
wow,
yeah, Haley's bringing it in.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, Coach.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, look at that. For all employees, this will be available in the kitchen soon.
Absolutely. The round number's an interesting thing. Let's not mention the first number. I mean, we know the last number's 0.